Okay, so this is a walkthrough of one of the quiz questions on dynamic aggregate demand to aggregate supply. Specifically, what we're about to do here is solve for short-run equilibrium in the dynamic aggregate demand to aggregate supply model. So, first things first, we'll draw a quick graph. Then we'll use these equations here to figure out what the short-run equilibrium is. In the quiz question, you're told that money growth has fallen to 7%. You're told that the solo growth rate is 4%. And now we want to find the economy's short-run equilibrium with this lower money growth rate. So, what we're looking for is the inflation rate and the real economic growth rate that I just wrote in green. And so we have the following assets. First, we know that the money growth rate is 7%. So that's going to tell us something very important about aggregate demand. Second, we know the solo growth rate is 4%. Third, we were given that expected inflation was 5%. Fourth, we were given an equation for the short-run aggregate supply curve. Inflation is equal to expected inflation plus 1 times the difference between the economy's real growth rate and the solo growth rate. And then finally, we have the dynamic version of the quantity theory of money, where money growth plus velocity growth is equal to inflation plus real growth. For our purposes, we're assuming the velocity of money is not changing. So we assume that that's equal to 0. And now we can basically plug and chug and solve for this new equilibrium. I'll do the math in green. We know the money growth rate is 7%. Okay. We stick that into the aggregate demand curve. We know that the solo growth rate is 4%. We stick that in to the solo growth equation. We know that expected inflation is 5%. We put that in there. And so we have two expressions, one for aggregate demand, where the 7% money growth rate is equal to the inflation rate plus the economy's real growth rate. And then for short-run aggregate supply, inflation is equal to, 5%, that's expected inflation, plus 1 times, again, the gap between where the economy is and the economy's solo growth rate of 4%. Okay. Now, all we need to do is collect like terms and solve. So we want to get all of the inflations, all the pies on one side, and all of the growth rates on the other. So we rearrange our expression for aggregate demand. The inflation rate is equal to 7 minus the real growth rate. We have this expression for aggregate supply. And at this point, it's actually relatively straightforward. We set these two things equal to each other. We solve for y. Then we use that y to figure out what the inflation rate is. So just for the sake of completeness, let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to move all this over here. So we distribute the 1. So inflation is equal to 5 plus real growth minus 4, or 1 plus the economy's real growth rate. So now we have Inflation on one side, real growth on the other. That's short run aggregate supply. Inflation on one side, real growth on the other, that's aggregate demand. Set these two things equal to each other. So on the aggregate demand side, we have 7 minus the real growth rate is equal to, on the aggregate supply side, 1 plus the economy's real growth rate. Solve this by adding real growth to both sides and subtracting 1 from both sides, again, in order to get real growth on one side and all of your numerals on the other. 6 is equal to 2 times the real growth rate. This implies that in the short run, the economy's real growth rate is 3% per year. This implies if the economy's real growth rate is 3% per year and the money supply is growing at 7% per year, the inflation rate is just the difference between those. I is equal to 7 minus 3, 4%. You can check that, of course, by sticking it back into the short run aggregate supply equation, and you should get exactly the same answer. So inflation is equal to 1 plus the real growth rate. Real growth rate is 3%. Well, 1 plus 3 is 4. Done.